Welcome! Today we are diving into Matthew chapter 17. And let me tell you, this chapter is a real roller coaster. It takes us from this moment of just pure heavenly glory on a mountaintop and then slams us right down into a valley filled with some very human failure and doubt. And it's that contrast, that up and down, that shows us some incredible things about who Jesus really is and what faith looks like when you're not on the mountaintop. So, let's get into it.
Okay, so just picture this for a second. You're up on a remote mountain with a couple of your closest friends and your mentor, and all of a sudden, something totally impossible happens right in front of your eyes. Well, that is exactly where Matthew 17 kicks off, with a moment that feels like it just pulls back the curtain on reality itself.
And then, bam, Jesus is transformed. His face literally starts shining like the sun, and his clothes become this impossibly bright, dazzling white. Now, this isn't just a magic trick, it's a revelation. For just a few moments, his disciples get to see past the human teacher they know and get a glimpse of his true, divine identity.
So, this incredible event, it has a name, the Transfiguration, and it's way more than just a miracle. You have to see it as this pivotal moment that's designed to answer the one question the disciples were wrestling with more than any other. Who really is Jesus?
And you know, the word itself is super interesting. Transfigured comes from this Greek word metamorpho, which is actually where we get our word metamorphosis. So think about a caterpillar completely changing its form to become a butterfly. It's not just changing on the outside, it's revealing its true, intended nature. That is exactly what's happening to Jesus here. His inner divine glory is finally shining through.
Okay, and if that wasn't enough, it gets even wilder. Two absolute giants of Jewish history just appear out of nowhere, Moses and Elijah. And this isn't no random celebrity cameo. See, Moses represents the law, the foundation of their entire relationship with God. And Elijah? He represents the prophets, that whole long line of messengers who spoke for God. So having them both show up here, talking with Jesus, sends a crystal clear message. Jesus isn't just starting something new. He is the fulfillment of everything their entire history, their law, and their prophets had been pointing towards all along.
And then you get the climax of the whole scene. A bright cloud surrounds them, and this voice, the voice of God the Father, just booms from heaven. I mean, this is the ultimate endorsement, right? It confirms Jesus' identity as the one and only Son of God, and it gives a really simple, direct command. Listen to him. In other words, all authority now rests with Jesus.
But that incredible high from the mountaintop experience, well, it doesn't last. The story immediately brings us crashing right back down to earth, down into the valley, where the other disciples are in the middle of a scene of real human suffering and a very public failure. It's a jarring shift, and it raises a totally different question. What happens when our faith just isn't enough?
So down in the valley, there's this desperate father. He brought his son, who's suffering horribly, to the disciples for help, but they couldn't do anything. They were powerless. So of course, when Jesus shows up and handles it, they pull him aside later, and you can just feel their frustration, right? They're embarrassed, and they ask, why couldn't we do it? Jesus doesn't mince words here. He gives them a really direct diagnosis for why they failed. The problem wasn't that they lacked the right technique or authority. He'd already given them that. The problem was their unbelief, their little faith.
And this, right here, gets to the absolute heart of their failure. The disciples were looking inward. They were trying to summon up enough of their own spiritual strength, their own power to get the job done. But Jesus just flips that whole idea on its head. He teaches them that it's not about the size of your faith, it's about the object of your faith. It's about who you place it in. The power doesn't come from you, it comes from God.
And he just brilliantly illustrates this with one of the most famous metaphors in the entire Bible. He says that faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains. Now, obviously, he's using hyperbole here. The point isn't that we should be literally rearranging the landscape. The point is that even a tiny, tiny amount of genuine faith, when it's placed in an all-powerful God, can overcome what feels like an impossible obstacle.
And I mean, just so you get the picture, a mustard seed is tiny, about 1 millimeter. In that time, it was the go-to example for the smallest possible thing. So Jesus is saying, look, stop focusing on how big your faith is. Instead, focus on how big your God is. That's where the real power is.
So right when the disciples are trying to wrap their heads around this idea of mountain-moving faith, Jesus completely changes gears and brings them back to a hard reality they just can't seem to accept. He reminds them that his path to ultimate glory isn't going to be one of power, but one of suffering. For the second time now, Jesus tells them exactly what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. He'll be betrayed, he'll be killed, and then, after 3 days, he will rise again.
And this really gets at that big paradox. How can the glorious, all-powerful Son of God also be headed for suffering and death?
And their reaction just shows you how much they were struggling with this. They were greatly distressed. They had just seen a glimpse of his heavenly glory. They'd just seen his power over impossible situations, but they still could not square that with the idea of a suffering Messiah. It just didn't compute.
And this brings us to the final story in the chapter, and honestly, it's kind of a weird one. It's got a question about taxes, a conversation about kings, and a miraculous fish. And it's all there to teach this really profound lesson about how our faith actually works in the real world.
Okay, so let's walk through this, because it's pretty memorable. It starts when the temple tax collectors ask Peter, "Hey, does your teacher pay the tax?" Later, Jesus brings it up with Peter and makes a really interesting point. He asks, "Peter, do kings tax their own children, or do they tax other people?" Well, the answer's obvious. They tax other people. Jesus' point is clear. As the Son of God, he's technically a child of the king in this scenario, so he's exempt from a tax for his own father's house. But, and this is the key, he chooses to pay it anyway. Why? To avoid causing a needless argument. And then he does it with this little miracle, telling Peter to go catch a fish, and sure enough, inside its mouth is the exact amount of money they need.
And that one little phrase right there, "so that we may not cause offense," that is the whole point of the story. Jesus had the freedom. He had the right not to pay that tax, but he chose to set aside that right for a much greater purpose, to avoid creating a pointless barrier that would just get in the way of his real message.
So as we start to wrap up, how do we connect these four pretty different scenes? You've got the mountaintop, the valley, the prophecy, the fish. What's the thread that ties it all together? Well, when you put it all together, Matthew 17 really leaves us with a few profound things to think about.
First, it all starts with who Jesus is. He's the divine Son of God, the one that the law and the prophets were pointing to all along. Second, we get this masterclass on the power of faith, that it's not about how strong we are, but about connecting to how strong God is. And finally, we get this beautiful, practical lesson in humility, that true freedom, true strength, is sometimes shown by laying down our rights for the sake of other people.
And that leaves us with a final thought to reflect on. We all have mountains in our lives, right? Those impossible situations, those challenges that just feel way too big to ever overcome. This chapter kind of invites us to ask ourselves, what might change if we stopped worrying about how big or small our own faith is, and instead just shifted our focus to the greatness and the power of God? Thanks for joining this explainer.